Oh, you're still here. I honestly didn't expect that. Let's talk about superheroes. It seems we've reached an era of ongoing topical callbacks on this show. Not that I'm complaining, mind you, but it certainly does make one think. At least I'd hope. Getting back to the point at hand, a while back, I dedicated an entire episode of this non-stop bitch fest of mine to my ongoing resentment for the unrestricted application of multiverse theory in superhero comics. More specifically, the unapologetic extent to which it's used as a narrative crutch for creatively bankrupt writers looking for an easy out once the inspirational well has run dry. Have you written your story and/or characters into a developmental corner with no natural means of resolving the issues you've put there? Boom! Soft reboot on Earth 987. Not enough sales to justify the continuation of the current story arc? Boom! Soft reboot on Earth 5555. And if that sounds like a gross oversimplification to you, Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour, Crisis in Time, Ultimate Marvel, Infinite Crisis, 52, Final Crisis, The New 52, Marvel Now, Convergence, Secret Wars, All New, All Different Marvel, DC Rebirth, Marvel Legacy, New Justice, Fresh Start, Infinite Frontier. And that's not even counting the individual IP reboots. Long story made somewhat less long. When every theoretical outcome that could potentially play out in the world of any given story is established as canon, it strips the very concept of canonicity of any and all gravity, and with it, the term's original definition. That is to say, when everything in a story that could be canon is canon, then nothing is canon. And if nothing in a story is canon, then nothing in that story matters. And if nothing in a story matters, it's a bad story. Progression and development can only exist in the presence of consequence and permanency. And multiverse theory, when applied as outlined here, completely demolishes those pillars of storytelling. That being said, the more time that's passed since I initially released that video, the more I've come to realize that the problems with modern superhero stories don't stop there. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the major issues are much more fundamental in nature. And once again, it all comes back to the very definitions we use to describe them. Superhero. Noun. A fictional hero having extraordinary or superhuman powers. Superhuman. Adjective. Being above the human. Divine. Or alternatively, exceeding normal human power, size, or capability. Herculean. Superpower. Noun. Excessive or superior power, or alternatively, a power or ability of the kind possessed by superheroes, a superhuman power. Mind you, a lot of abilities fitting these descriptions have actually popped up in living human beings. Spend an evening binge watching Stan Lee's Superhumans and it'll really put the potential for human evolution into perspective. Even then, the somewhat vague nature of Webster's definition of what a superhuman can be leaves a lot to the imagination. I mean, exceeding normal human power, size, or capability? That could mean anything. Turning into other life forms, manipulating different states of matter, being able to see things other people are incapable of seeing without technological assistance. The list is pretty much endless. So with all this potential for creativity, limited only by the near-limitless canvas of the human imagination, why are so many superpowered characters so fucking uninspired? Even discounting the dozens upon dozens of powers that have been recycled time and time again over the past century, in nearly every superhero-themed story I've read, watched, or listened to, there are always at least a handful of characters sporting the least creative abilities conceivable. You know, the ilk of which you'd find in Baby's first RP forum. Powers like copying other people's powers, reflecting said powers back at the original user except amplified by several orders of magnitude, taking other people's powers away, or the creme de la creme of unoriginality, the ability to do and know anything. Also, excuse Excuse this minor side tangent, but going back to the whole stealing other people's powers thing, when the narrative attempts to spin the worst case scenario as condemning the protagonist to a life of implied mediocrity, a term which in and of itself is inherently classist horseshit and to perpetuate the fictitious concept of unskilled labor and dismiss the fact that literally everyone excels at something, it sets a precedent for the story's expectations of what the reader/viewer's personal standards for themselves should be. As if to say, if you're not truly remarkable at this one thing or one set of things, then you're not worth anything. Anyways, onwards and downwards. It's only ever once in a blue moon that you come across a story that, by and large, treats the idea of superpowers with the creativity it truly deserves. Stories like, and believe me, I know exactly how this is going to sound, Ichiro Oda's One Piece. Yeah, somehow, amidst a literal sea of problematic elements, including, but not limited to, whitewashing, questionable depictions of people within the LGBTQIA+ community, and disturbingly unrealistic standards of female beauty, one of the few things One Piece does right is the unique level of thought put into its characters' powers. I mean, one of the most universally feared antagonistic figures in the series is a guy who can turn himself into Mochi. King Mochi, the flubber of the dessert world. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Taking a concept as goofy as being able to turn yourself into food and finding ways to make it genuinely intimidating is about as creative a feat as one can achieve when writing stories about super-empowered individuals. And yet, even One Piece is guilty of falling into the age-old trap of schoolyard god-moding with its endgame antagonist, who, by the way, shares a voice actor with the endgame antagonist from My Hero Academia, who, funnily enough, is just as guilty of the exact same thematic sin. Now, if you want to see an example of superpowers done right in live action, I highly recommend the My Hero Academia spin-off pilot UALA, written and directed by Christopher Clark Cohen. While the main attraction is inarguably the awe-inspiring fight choreography coordinated and performed by MCU veteran Guy De Silva, aka the stunt actor for the Black Panther, the hidden gem in this short film is the genuine creativity that went into the characters' individual quirks, not only on the basis of how infrequently we tend to see these types of powers, but also how they serve as windows into the personalities and potential motivations of those characters, with a little bit of social commentary thrown in for good measure. Which leads me to my other major criticism of this genre, one which no one either seems willing or able to address, that being that stories of superheroism have kinda sorta become culturally obsolete, at least as we've come to know them. I mean, all mimetic references notwithstanding, society, and consequently the world of fiction itself, genuinely has progressed past the need for traditional superheroes. Between Watchmen, The Umbrella Academy, Doom Patrol, Raising Dion, The Boys, Jupiter's Legacy, The Incredibles, One Punch Man, My Hero Academia, Invincible, etc. Whether intentional or otherwise, this recurring trend of using mass media to shine a spotlight on how societal structures built around superheroism just straight up don't work, has culminated in a large-scale artistic and philosophical movement based around the deconstruction of the superhero identity itself. A movement I like to refer to as the erosion of Olympus. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, I know, but copyright law dictates that I stay in my lane on this one. The basic idea is that as time goes on, the mysticism behind the world and how it works, as well as the authority of those who claim to have a greater understanding of these things than anyone else, are gradually lost to discovery. Much in the same way that adults no longer anticipate the arrival of Santa Claus or fear the presence of the boogeyman, humanity is slowly but surely coming to terms with the fairy tale concept of an elite select few being the keys to solving all the world's problems, being yet another unfortunate case of grass is always greener syndrome, due in no small part to our faith in increasingly powerful authority figures being repeatedly and tragically left unrewarded. Even if you argue that the point of making shining examples of the empowered few is to encourage action on the part of the impoverished many, I'd argue that the original concept behind superheroes amounts to little more than mankind's collective desire to not have to take responsibility for anything. We don't have to worry about bank robbers or domestic terrorism because the Justice League/Avengers are looking out for us. We don't have to worry about climate change, human rights violations, or global pandemics because the police, military, and our elected officials are looking out for us. Something death to fascism and late-stage capitalism. Subscribe to Kyle Colgren. Julian Jaynes' 1976 publication, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, put forward the hypothesis that human sentience arose out of societal necessity. After the voices in our heads we interpreted as gods went silent, leaving us with no one but ourselves to tell us how to live our lives. And while the idea has all but since been put to bed in the face of inconclusive scientific evidence, and by inconclusive, I mean the man just straight up admits to cherry-picking his data at the beginning of the book, it does raise an interesting point about the role theology plays in how we identify what is or isn't quote-unquote super. See, the thing about golden idols is that they only exist for one reason: to be worshipped. They don't actually do anything to warrant said worship, it's more the idea of what they could potentially be doing that tends to justify worshipping them in the first place, at least in the minds of their worshippers. That's what superheroes have always been, historically speaking, a source of comfort through the fantasy of people far more capable than ourselves making all the bad things go away. And the more stories we tell that serve to dismantle these notions of security through blind hero worship, the more it's made plain just how desperately this genre is in need of a conceptual overhaul. No, not that one. Personally speaking, what I'd love to see in a superhero story is something with less of an emphasis on the actions of any one individual and more on the actions of an entire community. Picture, if you will, a neighborhood that's had more than enough of their local police department's bullshit. Not that difficult to imagine, but hear me out. Maybe, after being inspired by the heroic acts of a handful of people within that neighborhood, they realize just how much of a difference they can make on their own, and decide to band together to establish new methods of protection for themselves and others. Kinda like a neighborhood watch if it were comprised of volunteer vigilantes. Obviously, this would pose more than a few legal problems, and would inevitably lead to ethical and literal conflict both outside and within this community. But that would be the point of the narrative. Ripples made in the way these characters tend to think of justice and law enforcement would serve both to encourage and empower those who have previously been made to feel powerless, and over time it would completely change the face of the concept behind heroism within the world of that story. Think Batman, but on a much larger and far more cost-effective scale. I think My Hero Academia had the potential to at least explore this idea when it kicked the series off with a quite literally powerless central protagonist living in a world teeming with superheroes, but ultimately it decided to go the route of overcompensation and empowered said protagonist above and beyond what anyone else in that series is capable of, which is honestly kind of disappointing. It's easy enough to get behind the idea of billionaire playboys, alien demigods, or radioactive mutants making an impact on the world at large, because most of us can't imagine people like ourselves having that degree of influence. But you have to remember that even the most individually exceptional among us rarely get anywhere in life without any kind of help. The reason so many species of eusocial arthropods have become so evolutionarily successful is because they work as a collective unit towards a common goal. That's why they're literally referred to as superorganisms. Back in the early days of capes and spandex, the problems most prevalent in the minds of most comic book writers were comparatively simple, and that simplicity had a direct influence on how they'd imagine said issues could be resolved by people born or gifted with these kinds of special abilities. But since then, so many more things have either come to light or changed with the times that even in the world of fiction, it's no longer a viable option to leave the fate of the world to rest on any one person's shoulders. Anything can start with one person, to be sure, but it falls upon the rest of us to see that domino effect of global change fully come to fruition. And for any of you in the comments section about to dig up the near-omnipotent Dr. Manhattan, you can only default to the nuclear option so many times before there's nothing left for you to rebuild from.